The moment Electra drew the line, everything changed, not just for Will, but for the fragile web of trust that had been holding their lives together. It was never simply about love, not in the way people like to romanticize it, soft and forgiving and pure. What Electra offered was something far more dangerous, a love that demanded proof, sacrifice, and ultimately, a decision that would carve a permanent mark into Will's conscience. Her ultimatum did not come with raised voices or dramatic gestures, but with a quiet certainty that made it even more terrifying. Choose her or lose her. And in that silence, Will understood that whatever he chose, something inside him would not survive the aftermath intact. At first, the choice seemed obvious, almost deceptively so. Electra was the future, the person he had envisioned standing beside him when everything else in his life finally settled into place. She represented stability, passion, and a sense of belonging that he had fought hard to believe he deserved. Dylan, on the other hand, was part of a past that had grown complicated, tangled in misunderstandings, loyalty, and a kind of emotional honesty that did not fit neatly into Electra's expectations. And yet, reducing Dylan to the past was a lie Will could not fully convince himself to accept. Because Dylan had never simply been a chapter that could be closed without consequence. She had trusted him, believed in him, and more importantly, she had seen him at his most uncertain and still chosen to stay. That was what made Electra's demands so devastating. It wasn't just about removing Dylan from his life. It was about erasing a part of himself that had been shaped through that connection. And even as Will try to rationalize it, telling himself that relationships required difficult choices, that love sometimes demanded sacrifice, he could not escape the gnawing realization that this sacrifice was not mutual. Electra was not giving something up to meet him halfway. She was asking him to prove his love by cutting someone else out, by rewriting the boundaries of his own moral compass to fit her definition of loyalty. The days that followed felt like a slow descent into something heavier than guilt, something closer to self-betrayal. Will found himself rehearsing conversations in his head, trying to find a way to explain the decision he had not yet fully made, but already felt trapped by. He imagined telling Dylan that it was necessary, that it was for the sake of his future, that sometimes people had to let go even when they didn't want to. But every version of that explanation sounded hollow, stripped of a truth he was too afraid to say out loud. The truth was that he was choosing fear over integrity. Fear of losing Electra, fear of being alone, fear of not being enough. When a moment finally came, it did not unfold with the clarity or closure he had hoped for. Dylan did not scream, did not accuse him of betrayal in the dramatic way he had braced himself for. Instead, her reaction was quieter, and therefore far more devastating. There was a pause, a long, unbearable silence in which she seemed to search his face for something, perhaps a sign that he did not mean what he was saying, or that he would take it back before it was too late. And when that sign did not come, something in her expression shifted, not into anger, but into understanding. A painful, resigned understanding that cut deeper than any accusation could have. She did not fight him, and that was what stayed with Will long after the conversation ended. Dylan simply accepted it, not because it did not hurt, but because she recognized that the decision had already been made long before he spoke the words. That quiet acceptance turned his justification into something unbearable. It removed the illusion that he had been forced into the choice, revealing instead that he had chosen it willingly, even if reluctantly. And in that moment, he realized that keeping Electra would come at the cost of losing something far more difficult to replace. The version of himself that had once been capable of loyalty without conditions. Dylan's decision to leave town came quickly, almost as if she needed to escape before the weight of everything settled in. But her departure was not an act of defeat. It was an act of self-preservation, a refusal to remain in a place where her presence had become a source of conflict rather than connection. She understood, perhaps more clearly than Will did, that staying would only prolong the damage. And yet, her leaving did not bring the sense of resolution that Electra might have expected. Instead, it created a void, a quiet absence that echoed in every corner of Will's life. Electra, for her part, believed she had won. She had drawn a boundary and watched Will choose her, validating everything she had feared and demanded. But even in her victory, there was something fragile beneath the surface, something she could not quite name, but could certainly feel. Because love that is secured through ultimatums carries within it the constant threat of repetition. If Will could be made to choose once, he could be made to choose again. And somewhere deep down, Electra knew that a love built on conditions would always be haunted by the possibility of collapse. What neither of them fully understood at the time was that Dylan had never been the true source of their conflict. The tension, the insecurity, the need for control, all of it had existed long before Dylan became a convenient focal point. And as the days turned into weeks, that truth began to surface in subtle, unsettling ways. Will found himself increasingly restless, not because he regretted choosing Electra, but because the choice had not brought the peace he had expected. Instead, it had exposed cracks in their relationship that could no longer be ignored. Electra began to notice it too, the hesitation in his responses, the way his attention drifted at unexpected moments, the unspoken distance that lingered even when they were together. At first, she dismissed it as an adjustment period, the natural aftermath of a difficult decision. But as time passed, it became harder to ignore the possibility that something deeper had been broken, not between them, but within Will himself. And that realization began to unsettle her in ways she had not anticipated. Meanwhile, the truth about Dylan's role, or rather, her lack of wrongdoing, began to emerge. The narrative that had painted her as a disruptive force in Will and Electra's relationship started to unravel, revealing a far more complicated reality. Dylan had not been the one manipulating events or driving a wedge between them. She had simply been present, existing in a space that Electra felt threatened by. The real source of that manipulation, the quiet architect behind the tension, was someone far less obvious, someone who had managed to remain in the background while subtly influencing everything. Ivy's revelation did not come as a dramatic confession, but as a gradual exposure of inconsistencies, small details that began to connect in ways that could no longer be ignored. Her involvement had been calculated, strategic, designed to create just enough doubt and pressure to push Will and Electra toward conflict. She understood their vulnerabilities, knew exactly how to exploit them, and had done so with a precision that left very little room for suspicion. Until now, when the truth finally surfaced, it did not bring immediate clarity or relief. Instead, it forced everyone involved to confront the consequences of decisions made under false assumptions. For Will, the realization was almost unbearable. He had made a choice that altered the course of multiple lives, not based on truth, but on a manipulation he had failed to see. The weight of that realization settled heavily on him, reshaping his understanding of everything that had happened. Electra's reaction was equally complex. On one hand, she felt a surge of anger, not just at Ivy, but at the situation itself, at the realization that her demand had been built on a lie. But beneath that anger was something more difficult to confront: guilt. Because regardless of Ivy's manipulation, the ultimatum had been her decision. She had chosen to draw that line, to force a choice that ultimately caused irreparable damage. And now, she was left to face the consequences of that choice, without the comfort of believing it had been justified. The exposure of Ivy's actions shifted the narrative, but did not undo the past. Dylan was gone, her absence a constant reminder of what had been lost. Will and Electra were left to navigate a relationship that had been fundamentally altered, not just by external forces, but by the choices they had made in response to them. And as they struggled to rebuild, they were forced to confront a difficult truth. Love, no matter how strong, cannot survive without trust, and trust, once broken, is far more difficult to restore than either of them had anticipated. In the end, the question was no longer about who Will had chosen, but about whether that choice had been worth the cost. And as he stood in the quiet aftermath of everything that had unfolded, he could not escape the lingering doubt that perhaps the real loss was not Dylan, or even the version of his relationship with Electra that no longer existed. But the part of himself that had believed love should never require sacrificing one's integrity. There are moments in a story when everything seems to slow down, when the world narrows into a single possibility so fragile and yet so explosive that it threatens to reshape every life it touches. And the emerging thread between Daphne and Carter carries exactly the kind of dangerous potential. A quiet suggestion at first, almost easy to overlook, but beneath it lies the kind of emotional detonation that soap operas are built on, the kind that does not simply create conflict but exposes the deepest vulnerabilities of the human heart, and the possibility of a pregnancy, whether real or imagined, whether truth or manipulation, becomes not just a plot device, but a mirror reflecting everything both of them have been trying to hide from themselves. At its surface, the idea seems straightforward, almost predictable in the language of drama. A woman might be pregnant, a man might be forced to confront responsibility, a relationship might be pushed into a future neither of them has fully chosen. But what makes this situation so compelling is not the event itself, but the emotional terrain it opens up, because for Carter, the suggestion of a child is not simply about stepping into fatherhood. It is about being pulled into a version of life that demands permanence, stability, and a kind of emotional commitment he may not yet be capable of sustaining. And that hesitation is not rooted in cruelty or indifference, but in something far more human and far more unsettling: the fear that he will fail, the fear that he will become trapped in a life defined by obligation rather than choice, and the fear that once he steps forward, there will be no way back. For Daphne, however, the situation exists on an entirely different emotional frequency, because whether the pregnancy is real or not, the idea of it is already charged with meaning, already tied to something deeper than circumstance. It is tied to her longing to be chosen, not temporarily, not conditionally, but completely and irrevocably. And that longing is not born from weakness, but from a history of emotional instability, of moments where love felt uncertain, where connection felt fragile, where happiness always seemed to come with an expiration date she could never control. And so the possibility of a child becomes more than a biological reality. It becomes a symbol of permanence, a way to anchor something that has always felt like it could drift away at any moment. If the pregnancy is real, then the story immediately shifts into a space where both characters are forced to confront truths they have been avoiding. Because Carter can no longer exist in the comfort of ambiguity, he cannot keep one foot in and one foot out, cannot continue navigating the relationship as something undefined. And that pressure does not create clarity, it creates tension, because being forced into a decision does not guarantee that the decision will be honest, and in many ways. It is far more dangerous for Carter to say yes out of obligation than it is for him to hesitate, because a future built on fear of doing the wrong thing can become a prison just as suffocating as one built on lies. And yet, even as Carter struggles with the weight of that possibility, Daphne's emotional reality continues to evolve in a direction that is far less stable. Because if the pregnancy is real, then she must also confront the terrifying possibility that even something as significant as a child may not be enough to secure the love she craves. And that fear does not manifest as quiet resignation. It manifests as intensity, as a heightened need for reassurance, as a growing sensitivity to every hesitation, every pause, every moment where Carter's uncertainty becomes visible. And in that space, love begins to transform into something more volatile, something that demands constant validation, something that cannot tolerate doubt. But the story becomes even more complex, even more psychologically charged, if the pregnancy is not real, if it is instead a misunderstanding, a false alarm, or worse, a deliberate act born from desperation. Because in that version of events, the narrative shifts away from circumstance and into the realm of choice, into the territory of moral ambiguity and emotional survival. And Daphne is no longer simply reacting to a situation. She is shaping it, manipulating it, not out of malice, but out of fear, out of a belief that without some kind of drastic action, she will lose the one thing she cannot bear to let go of. In that scenario, every decision she makes becomes layered with contradiction, because on one hand, she understands a risk, understands a deception, even if temporary, can destroy trust in a way that cannot be undone, but on the other hand, she is driven by a need so powerful that it overrides that understanding, a need to hold on, to secure something that has never felt secure, and that internal conflict becomes the true heart of the story, not the lie itself, but the emotional reasoning behind it, the way fear can distort perception, the way love can blur the line between right and wrong, the way desperation can convince someone that the end justifies the means. For Carter, the revelation of such a truth, if it comes to light, would not simply be a moment of anger or betrayal. It would be a moment of profound disorientation, because it would force him to reevaluate everything, to question not just Daphne's actions, but his own role in creating the conditions that led to them. And that is where the story finds its most compelling tension, because it is not enough for him to condemn her, not if he recognizes that his own emotional distance, his own inability to fully commit, may have contributed to her sense of instability. And in that recognition lies a deeper conflict, one that cannot be resolved through blame alone. At the same time, Daphne's potential deception, if it exists, cannot be simplified into a single narrative of wrongdoing, because it emerges from a place that is deeply human, deeply relatable, the fear of abandonment, the terror of being left behind, the instinct to fight for something even when the methods are flawed, and that does not excuse the behavior, but complicates it, forces the audience to sit with discomfort, to acknowledge that people do not always act in ways that are clean or morally consistent when they feel that something essential is slipping away. What makes this storyline so powerful is the way it intertwines these emotional threads, the way it refuses to present a clear villain or a clear victim, because both Daphne and Carter exist in a space where their actions are shaped by their fears, their desires, and their limitations. And the potential pregnancy, whether real or imagined, becomes the catalyst that brings all of those elements to the surface, that forces them to confront not just each other, but themselves. As the tension builds, the atmosphere around them begins to change, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but increasingly difficult to ignore. Conversations become more cautious, more loaded with unspoken meaning. Moments of silence carry more weight than words. And the relationship itself begins to feel less like a source of comfort and more like a space of uncertainty, where every interaction is tinged with the awareness that something is not entirely stable, not entirely secure. And in that shifting atmosphere, the future becomes a question mark rather than a destination. Because regardless of the truth behind the pregnancy, the emotional damage, the strain, the unresolved fears, all of it continues to linger, shaping the way both of them move forward, influencing their decisions, their reactions, their ability to trust not just each other, but their own instincts. If the pregnancy is real, then the challenge becomes whether they can build something authentic out of a situation that began under pressure, whether they can transform obligation into genuine connection, whether Carter can step into responsibility without losing himself, whether Daphne can find security without demanding it at any cost. And that journey is not guaranteed to succeed, because it requires both of them to grow, to confront uncomfortable truths, to let go of the need for control. If the pregnancy is not real, then the path becomes even more uncertain, because the foundation of the relationship itself is called into question, and rebuilding trust in that context is not simply a matter of forgiveness. It is a matter of redefining what the relationship means, of deciding whether it is worth saving at all. And that decision cannot be made lightly, cannot be resolved through a single conversation, because it touches on something deeper than the immediate conflict. It touches on the fundamental compatibility of their emotional needs. In the end, the storyline does not hinge on whether Daphne is pregnant, but on what that possibility reveals about both of them, about the ways in which love can be both a source of strength and a source of vulnerability, about the ways in which fear can shape behavior in ways that are difficult to justify but impossible to fully condemn, and about the fragile balance between holding on and letting go. Because sometimes the most dramatic turning point is not the event itself, but the realization that the people involved are no longer who they were before it happened, that something has shifted, something has been exposed, something has changed in a way that cannot be undone. And for Daphne and Carter, that shift may ultimately define not just the future of their relationship, but the way they understand love, trust,